Imagine standing on the porch of the most beautiful home you have ever owned. A home built dollar by dollar with your own two hands after losing absolutely everything, and hearing the sound of a car pulling into your driveway. You recognize the car. You recognize the faces stepping out. And something cold moves through your chest, not fear, but something far more complicated than that. 12 years. 12 years of locked doors, unanswered calls, and a silence so heavy it carved itself into your bones. 12 years of being told you were not good enough, not rich enough, not worth keeping around. They threw you out of your own family like you were disposable, and they never looked back. Not once. Not a birthday card. Not a single word. And then one morning, the very same people who erased you from their lives pulled into your driveway with bright smiles on their faces and said the words that made your jaw drop. "Hey, we're moving in since you have all this extra room." Just like that. As if 12 years of silence had been nothing more than a long vacation. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined in their worst nightmares, was that while they were busy writing you off, you were quietly building something they would never be able to touch. And what unfolded on that porch, the secrets dragged into daylight, the recordings kept for over a decade, the letters sealed and waiting for exactly this moment, and the legal trap already closed around them, will leave you stunned from beginning to end. Stay with me, because this story does not just deliver justice, it delivers something far more powerful. My name is Clifford Mercer, though most people who know me well have always called me Cliff. I am 67 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades I have worked with my hands restoring broken furniture, breathing new life into old wood, and finding quiet dignity in the kind of craft that most of the modern world has long since decided is not worth the time. That is who I am. That is who I have always been. The morning it all came to a head was a Sunday, which felt appropriate somehow because Sundays had always been the one day of the week I allowed myself to simply exist without armor. I was sitting in the oak rocking chair on the front porch of my colonial house, the one with the white facade and the black shutters, and the tall windows that catch the morning light in a way that still stops me cold. Every single time, look at them. I had a cup of coffee going cold on the porch rail beside me. The roses along the front walk were just beginning to open deep red against the green, and the valley below the hill was still wrapped in a thin morning mist that made everything look like something out of a painting. I had earned this porch. I had earned every inch of this view, every board beneath my feet, every nail and coat of paint. 12 years of earning it, starting from nothing, starting from less than nothing, starting from the kind of empty that gets into your chest and makes it hard to remember who you were before. I was 55 years old the last time I saw my son Derek's face up close. That was 12 years ago, and the world I was living in back then would be almost unrecognizable to me now. I was renting a small house on Maple Street, the kind of place where the floors creaked in the cold and the windows rattled when a truck went by too fast. My wife Ellie had passed 2 years before that, taken by breast cancer in the slow and terrible way that disease takes people. And I was still moving through every day with the particular heaviness that comes from losing the person who made the whole world make sense. I had my craft. I had my tools. I had Derek, and I had his daughter Nora, who was 6 years old and had her grandmother's eyes and a laugh that could fill a room 3 times the size of any room she was standing in. That was my world. I thought it was enough to hold on to. I thought the worst of it was already behind me. I was wrong about that in a way I still find difficult to put into words. I had been sitting on that porch for about 40 minutes that Sunday morning, thinking about nothing in particular, when I heard the sound of tires on the gravel at the end of the drive. I did not look up right away. Visitors were unusual, but not unheard of, and my neighbor Walter had a habit of pulling in slow like that when he was carrying something from the hardware store. But something made me set my coffee down, something in the particular rhythm of that engine. Or maybe something older than sound, some instinct built up over 67 years of living told me to pay attention. I looked up. The car was a silver sedan, older model, one of the rear panels slightly dented, the kind of car that has been kept running out of necessity rather than affection. It sat at the end of my driveway for a long moment without anyone getting out. The engine cut off. Silence settled back over the yard. Then the doors opened. The first person out was a woman with short hair and a bright, practiced smile that arrived on her face the way a mask arrives all at once and fully formed. Behind her came a man with his shoulders already curled inward, his hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere around the middle distance between himself and the ground, and last standing beside the rear door, as though she was still deciding whether to step forward, was a young woman of about 18 with dark hair pulled back and an expression on her face that I could not read from where I sat, something between recognition and a grief she had not had words for yet. I set my coffee cup on the porch rail and stood up slowly. 12 years. They had not called. They had not written. They had not sent so much as a single word in 12 years. And now here they were, standing at the end of my driveway on a Sunday morning in a car that had seen better days. The woman with the practiced smile started walking toward my porch steps like she already knew the way. She looked up at the house the way people look at things they are calculating the value of. Then she looked at me and her smile went wider and she said the words I will never forget for as long as I live. "Hey, Dad. We heard you moved. This place is gorgeous. You have so much extra room up here, we thought maybe we could stay for a while. I want to tell you about the last morning they came to my door, not the morning you just witnessed, but the one that started all of this. The one 12 years ago that I have turned over in my mind. So many times it has worn smooth like a stone carried too long in a coat pocket. Because before you can understand what it meant to see Vanessa walking up my porch steps on that Sunday morning with her bright, calculating smile, you need to understand what she did the first time she came to a door of mine. You need to feel the weight of what that Tuesday cost me. It was an ordinary morning on Maple Street. I had been awake since before sunrise, the way I always was in those days, because sleep had become something that happened to other people in the 2 years since Ellie passed. I had a pot of coffee going, and the radio on low, one of those old AM stations that plays standards from the 40s and 50s, and I was standing at the kitchen window watching the light come up over the neighbor's fence when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, clean and deliberate, the kind of knock that is not asking permission. I knew before I opened the door that something was wrong. 30 years of marriage teaches you to read silences, and 30 years of being a father teaches you to read knuckles on wood. Those 3 raps said this is not a visit, this is an announcement. Derek was standing slightly behind Vanessa when I opened the door, which told me everything about the conversation they had already finished in the car on the way over. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes were doing that thing they did when he had already surrendered something when the argument was over before it reached me. His shoulders were curved inward like a man bracing for weather. Vanessa stood in front of him with the posture of someone who has rehearsed a speech and is ready to deliver it and would prefer not to be interrupted. Little Nora was pressed against her mother's side, one small hand gripping the fabric of Vanessa's sleeve, her dark eyes moving back and forth between her parents and me with the careful watchfulness of a child who has learned that adult conversations sometimes end badly. Vanessa did not say good morning. She did not call me Dad, which she had done selectively in better times. She said Clifford. Just that. My full first name stripped of everything else, the way you address a stranger you need something formal from. She said she and Derek had made a decision as a family, and the way she said the word family carried a door in it, and I was on the outside of that door, and it was already closing. She said they had decided it would be best if I no longer had contact with them. Or with Nora. She said I was too old-fashioned, my lifestyle was not the influence they wanted around their daughter, that my circumstances were not what they needed for Nora to have the kind of life she deserved. Each sentence came out measured, and even like she had timed them, like she knew exactly how many words it would take to dismantle 20-something years, and had practiced getting it done efficiently. I looked past her at Derek. I wanted him to tell me this was not what it appeared to be. I wanted him to find whatever was left of his own voice and use it. He looked at the ground. I said his name. I said, "Son." He looked up once briefly, and what I saw in his face was not anger and not indifference, but something worse than either of those things. It was the look of a man who has already made his peace with a choice he knows is wrong and has decided that the shame of it is the price he is willing to pay. Then Vanessa said the second thing, the thing I had not seen coming, the thing that turned my knees to water. She said the house was in Ellie's name when she passed. She said it had transferred to Derek. She said they had consulted a lawyer. She said they would need me out by the end of the week and they were changing the locks that morning. Derek reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a new lock set. His hands were shaking badly enough that I could see it from where I stood. He would not look at me as he walked past and knelt down at my own front door with a screwdriver and began to take apart the lock I had turned every day for years. The sound of metal on metal filled the space where words should have been. I said his name again quietly. I said, "Please do not do this." His hands went still for one moment, just one, and then Vanessa said, "Keep going," and he kept going. I do not know how long I stood there watching. Long enough that Nora had grown restless and fidgety at her mother's side, and then the little girl did something that I have carried with me every single day of the 12 years since. When Vanessa was turned away, Nora reached into the front pocket of her small jacket and pressed something into my hand. It was a paper crane, small and carefully folded, the kind you make when you are sitting in a car and you need something to do with your hands and your heart. Her tiny fingers squeezed mine, and she looked up at me and whispered so softly I had to bend down to hear it. She said, "Grandpa, don't forget me." Then Vanessa took her by the hand and pulled her toward the car and said, "Say goodbye to Grandpa, Nora. You won't be seeing him anymore." I watched the car back out of the driveway. I watched Nora press her small face against the rear window and keep her eyes on me until the car turned the corner and disappeared. I stood on that porch, holding a paper crane until the street was completely quiet again. And when it was, I looked down at my own front door with its new lock that I did not have the key to, and I understood that my son had not just changed a lock, he had closed a door on everything I thought I knew about who I was to the people I loved most. I found a garage apartment 3 blocks from that house on Maple Street, which felt like the right kind of distance at the time, close enough that I could not entirely pretend the previous chapter of my life had happened somewhere else far. Enough that I did not have to drive past the new lock on my plan. Old front door every morning. The apartment had been a mechanic's workspace before someone put up a few sheets of drywall and called it housing. The kitchenette was the size of a coat closet. The bathroom was so narrow I had to turn sideways to dry off after a shower. The single main room served as bedroom and living room and workshop all at once, which meant that the smell of linseed oil and wood stain became the permanent smell of my life for the years that followed. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this often and with great conviction. 12 years later, I was still telling myself the same thing, and the apartment was still there, and so was I. The first months were the hardest in ways I did not fully understand until they were behind me. I would wake before dawn and lie in the dark, listening to the buildings settle around me and try to locate myself inside my own life, try to find some solid ground to stand on, where there was only the particular silence of a man who has had everything familiar taken from him all at once. I kept the radio on most of the time for the company of other voices. I drank too much coffee and not enough of anything else. I waited for the phone to ring in a way that was less about expecting it to ring and more about needing to believe that it still could. It never did. Not from Derek. Not once in 12 years. What saved me in the way that ordinary things save people was work. Word moved through the neighborhood the way it always does, in places where people have been living side by side long enough to notice when something changes. A woman 2 streets over needed a cabinet rehung. A man on the corner had a rocking chair with a cracked leg he could not afford to replace. A retired teacher asked if I could strip and refinish a dining table her mother had owned before the war. I said yes to all of it. The pay was modest and the jobs were small, but they kept my hands occupied, and I had learned long before then that occupied hands are a mercy when the mind is working against you. I built up a quiet reputation for doing careful work without cutting corners, for treating other people's things the way I would want my own things treated. It was not much, but it was mine, and nobody could take it from me, and on the days when everything else felt like it had been hollowed out, that mattered more than I can say. Walter Hale lived 2 doors down in a brick house with a rose garden he tended with the focused attention of someone who has decided that this particular thing will be done right, regardless of what else is happening in the world. He was about 15 years my senior, retired after 3 decades as a union contract negotiator, the kind of man whose eyes have spent so many years reading people across bargaining tables that the habit has become permanent. He missed nothing. He said little. On Sunday mornings he would appear at my door with 2 cups of coffee from the diner up the block, and we would sit together on the concrete steps outside the apartment and watch the neighborhood come to life. And most mornings we did not say more than a handful of words between us. I do not know if Walter understood in those early years what those Sunday mornings meant to me. They were the one fixed point in a week that otherwise had no shape, the 1 hour when I did not feel entirely invisible inside my own existence. About 3 years in, on one of those mornings when the grief was sitting particularly close to the surface, he looked over at me with those steady negotiator's eyes and said, "You are stronger than you think, Cliff. I have watched men come apart from less than this. You are still here. That counts for something." I was not sure I believed him, but I held on to the words the way you hold on to a railing in the dark. Not because you are certain it will hold, but because it is there and your hand needs something. I had kept my old post office box. I cannot tell you exactly why, except that it felt like the last thread connecting me to the life I had before the Tuesday they came to my door with a new lock. A few years after the silence began, something strange started happening. Every so often, with no pattern I could predict, a plain white envelope would appear in that box with no return address. Inside would be cash folded small, $20, sometimes occasionally 40, once 60. No note, no explanation, no name. I never spent a single dollar of it. Instead, I bought a small wooden box at a yard sale and wrote 2 words on the lid in careful block letters: for Nora. Every envelope went inside it, untouched in the order it arrived. I did not know where the money was coming from. I told myself it did not matter. What mattered was keeping it against the possibility of a day I could not yet see clearly from where I was standing. Every June, I knew which Saturday was Nora's birthday. I knew because I had stood behind the maple tree across from Derek and Vanessa's house every single year, watching the balloons, hearing the children laugh, watching my granddaughter grow taller and more like her grandmother with every passing year. I never stayed long enough for anyone to notice the old man at the edge of the yard. I only stayed long enough to see that she was alive and happy and well. Then I turned and walked back to my garage apartment alone. Then, in my 9th year of that life, a small repair job arrived that opened a door I had not known I was still looking for. Her name was Agnes Whitfield, and she was 87 years old, and she found my number on the bulletin board at the senior center on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. Her voice on the phone was the voice of someone who has learned to be persistent because the world has spent a long time assuming she can be redirected. She said she had a chest that needed restoring. She said it was cedar, that her mother had brought it over from Poland in 1952 when she came to this country with 2 suitcases, and a determination that Agnes described with a quiet pride that came through clearly even over the telephone. She said the wood had cracked along 2 of the panels, that the brass corner hardware had gone nearly black with age, that the lid hung sideways from the one hinge that had not yet given out entirely. She said her children had told her to throw it away and buy something new at one of those big furniture stores where everything is made to look like it might last and is actually designed not to. She said she could not do that. She said it in a way that did not require further explanation. I told her I would come by that evening and take a look. Her house was a small ranch-style place on the east side of town with a front garden that had been tended carefully for many decades and showed it. When she opened the door, I saw the chest immediately, because she had placed it in the center of the living room, the way you place something important, the way you give a thing, the space it deserves. It was in bad shape. The cedar panels had split along the grain in the way old wood splits when it has been through enough winters, without the right care, not violently but steadily the way time works on most things. The brass at the corners had oxidized to a flat, dark color that swallowed the light instead of catching it. The remaining hinge was hanging by 2 of its original 4 screws. A less patient eye would have looked at it and seen only damage. I looked at it and put my hand flat against the wood and felt the grain beneath the surface damage, felt the quality of what had been made, the care that had gone into the original construction, by someone who understood that the things we build to hold other things are themselves worth building. Well, I told Agnes I could restore it. I meant it. I worked on that chest for 3 weeks in the corner of my garage apartment most nights after 10 o'clock, when the rest of the building had gone quiet. I mixed wood filler to match the original cedar tone and worked it into the cracks with a palette knife, then sanded through 5 progressively finer grits until the repaired surface was indistinguishable from the wood around it under both touch and light. I soaked the brass hardware in a solution of white vinegar and salt for 48 hours, then polished each piece by hand until it reflected again. The hinge was beyond saving, and I drove to an architectural salvage shop 2 towns over on my one day off that week to find period-appropriate replacements, because the hardware on a chest like this is not decoration, it is part of the story of the object, and substituting something that did not belong would have been its own kind of damage. When I was finished, I sat back and looked at what it had been before I touched it and what it was now, and felt the particular quiet that comes from having done something correctly. When I brought it back to Agnes, she stood in her doorway for a long time without speaking. I set it down in the same spot in the center of her living room and stepped back, and she walked toward it slowly and stopped in front of it and reached out and ran her fingertips along the restored panels, along the brass corners that were catching the afternoon light the way they had been built to catch it 70 years ago. Then she sat down in the armchair beside it without taking her eyes off it, and I saw her shoulders begin to shake, and she cried the way older people cry, quietly and without apology, because they have lived long enough to know that some moments earn their tears. After a while she looked up at me and said, "You did not just fix a chest. You brought my mother back to me. I can feel her in this wood again." And then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "You fix things the way someone heals a broken heart. Carefully, with respect for what they used to be." I did not know what to do with that, so I told her I was glad I could help and refused most of what she tried to pay me and left before the moment could get any heavier. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Agnes took a photograph of the chest and of me standing beside it, and she posted it on her Facebook page with a caption about craftsmanship and kindness being rare in a world that had gotten too comfortable throwing things away. 3 days later, Walter knocked on my door with his phone held out and said, "Cliff, you need to see this." The post had been shared thousands of times. The comments were still coming in. People were tagging their friends, talking about furniture their grandparents had owned, asking how they could reach the man who restored things like he understood what they meant. My phone rang that evening for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. Then it rang again. Then it did not stop. The calls kept coming for days, and then for weeks, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped waiting for them to slow down and started trying to keep up with them instead. I took in more work than I had space for, which meant the garage apartment became impassable with other people's furniture in various stages of repair, and after about 3 weeks of turning sideways to get from the door to my workbench, I accepted that the space had stopped being sufficient. I found a narrow brick storefront on the edge of downtown that had been a shoe repair shop in another era and still had the ghost of that history in the worn tile floor and the low wooden counter along one wall. I signed a lease on a Tuesday morning, painted the name Mercer Restoration in gold letters on the front glass, hung a small bell above the door, and opened the following Monday. Within a week I had more work than I could schedule into a single month. Word was traveling faster than I could follow it, moving through the older neighborhoods and the senior community and the church circles and the kind of networks that exist between people who have known each other long enough to trust recommendation. They came with photographs of pieces they needed restored. They came with the pieces themselves, loaded carefully into truck beds and back seats and station wagons, wrapped in moving blankets and old quilts. Each one of them had a story, and each one of them told it to me before they left the piece in my care. Because that was the point. That was what they needed to know. I understood before they could leave something irreplaceable in the hands of a stranger. I was at my workbench on a morning in early June, elbow deep in refinishing a walnut dining table when the bell above the door rang. I looked up and wiped my hands on my apron, and my heart stopped. She was standing in the doorway with the late morning light coming in behind her, and the first thing I saw before anything else, before I registered who she was or why she looked familiar, were her eyes. Gray-blue, a particular shade that I had loved for 30 years and thought I would never see again outside of photographs. They were Ellie's eyes. They were her exact eyes, in a face that had aged differently but carried the same bone structure, the same stillness in the expression. It took me several seconds to put together who I was looking at, and when I did, the floor seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. It was Judith Calloway, Ellie's younger sister, standing in the doorway of my shop, looking at me the way someone looks at something they were not entirely sure still existed in the world. She said my name and her voice broke on it, and she said, "I have been looking for you." She said it had been 10 years of looking. She had tried calling the old house and gotten no answer. She had written letters to the address she had and received nothing back. She had driven to the neighborhood 3 separate times, and knocked on doors and been told different things by different people, none of them useful. She said she had almost given up. Then a photograph of a restored cedar chest had appeared on her Facebook feed 3 weeks ago, shared by a friend of a friend, and something about the man standing beside it had made her stop scrolling. She had zoomed in on my face and sat with it for a long time before she was certain. Then she drove here. I asked her why she had stopped trying to reach me. I asked it carefully because I did not want the question to sound like an accusation when it was really a confusion. She took out her phone and showed me an email. It had been sent from my account from the address I had used for years about 2 months after Ellie's funeral. It was formal and cool in a way I do not write and have never written, and it said that I was overwhelmed by grief, that having Ellie's family present made the loss harder to bear, that I was asking for space and would reach out when I was ready. It was signed with my name. I had never written a single word of it. I had not known it existed until that moment in my shop with Judith standing across the counter from me. Before that email arrived, she told me Vanessa had called her. About a month after the funeral, she said Vanessa had explained that I was struggling, that seeing Ellie's family was painful for me, that she would make sure I reached out when I felt ready. Judith had waited. Then the email came, and she had believed it because she had no reason not to. She said Ellie had told her something near the end in one of those late-night conversations that serious illness makes possible, that Vanessa had a way of closing spaces around people, of managing what information moved in which direction. Judith said she had not understood what her sister meant at the time. Standing in my shop, she said she understood it now. We were quiet for a moment, with the full weight of 12 wasted years settling between us. Then Judith straightened and looked around the shop with the eyes of someone who has spent her career in commercial real estate and cannot help assessing what she sees. She said she had not come only to find me. She said Ellie had left her a sum of money and she had been waiting for the right way to honor it, and she believed she had found it. She wanted to invest in expanding the business, real money, enough to move into a proper space with the right equipment and room to grow. She said she was not offering charity. She said she knew a sound investment when she was standing in front of one. That evening I sat at Walter's kitchen table while he read through every page of her proposal with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years making sure the words on a page meant exactly what they were supposed to mean. When he finished, he set it down and looked at me and said, "The terms are fair and the intent is clean." Then he said, "Ellie wanted you to live, Cliff, not to survive. This is the difference." I picked up the pen she had given me on our 25th anniversary and I signed my name. The transformation that followed was faster and more complete than I had allowed myself to imagine when I was sitting at Walter's kitchen table signing my name. Within 3 months of the partnership agreement, Judith had found a renovated warehouse space on the west side of town, a building with high ceilings and industrial windows that let in the kind of broad, even light that is genuinely useful when you are trying to match a stain or assess the surface of a piece of wood that has been through 100 years of use. There was room for a proper workshop in the back, a clean showroom in the front, and a small office near the entrance where Judith set up a desk and took over the business side of things with the brisk competence of someone who has been managing complicated moving parts for a long time and finds it more energizing than exhausting. We hired a young man named Tom who had left a construction job after a back injury and needed work that was still physical but more precise, and I spent the first few weeks teaching him the way I had been taught, which is to say, slowly and with attention to the reasoning behind each step, not just the steps themselves. The morning we opened, I arrived at 6 o'clock to find 12 people already waiting outside on the sidewalk. By noon, we had taken in 17 pieces and scheduled appointments 6 weeks out. There was a man who brought a writing desk his father had built in a shed in Vermont in 1948 and carried with him through 4 moves and 2 marriages. There was a woman who carried in a child's rocking chair her grandmother had owned the paint worn away at the arm where a hand had rested for 60 years. There was a retired minister with a partner's desk that had belonged to his grandfather, a piece so heavy it had taken 3 people to get it into the truck bed. Each one of them stood in front of their piece while they described it to me, and each one of them used the word important, or irreplaceable, or the only thing I have left of her. Judith stood in the office doorway at the end of that first morning, watching the last customer drive away, and shook her head slowly. She said, "Cliff, you have found something people have been hungry for without knowing how to name it. You are not just restoring furniture, you are telling people that the things they were made to feel embarrassed about keeping still have value. I thought about that for a long time after she said it. The Channel 7 call came about 6 weeks after we opened. A reporter named Laurel Jennings covered human interest stories for the local evening news, and her grandmother had seen the original post about Agnes Whitfield's cedar chest and had been following the business since. Laurel wanted to do a feature on what she described as a craftsman bringing something rare back to a world that had largely stopped believing in it. I almost said no. I had no interest in cameras or in having to explain myself to a lens, and something in me was still wary of visibility in a way that 12 years of living quietly had built into my habits. But Walter sat across from me at his kitchen table that evening and said simply that Ellie had not spent 30 years loving a man who was going to hide in a workshop for the rest of his life, and that was the end of that conversation. Laurel and her cameraman spent a full day at the shop. She filmed me working on a Victorian sideboard, interviewed several customers, and asked me the kind of questions that required real answers rather than short ones. I told her that in a world that had made disposability into a virtue, I wanted to prove that broken things could be made whole again, and that the damage something had accumulated over a long life was not a reason to let it go but a record of how much it had meant to someone. The segment aired on a Wednesday evening. I did not watch it. I sat on Walter's front steps instead and drank coffee while it was on, too aware of my own face to sit in front of a screen. About 20 minutes after it ended, his phone rang, and then it rang again, and then he came to the door and held it out to me and said, "You need to look at this right now." By the following morning, the segment had been shared across social media more times than either of us could track. A national publication about American craft and trade reached out for a longer interview. The appointment line ran 4 months out within a week. I stood in the middle of the workshop on a Thursday afternoon, looking at the pieces lined up along the walls, and understood perhaps for the first time with my whole self, rather than just my mind, that the life I had built from the rubble of the one I had lost was not a consolation version of something better. It was the real thing. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, was that 200 miles away, a young woman of 18 was sitting in her dormitory room between classes when that same segment appeared on her phone screen shared by someone she barely knew. She watched it once, then twice, then a third time, her eyes fixed on the face of the man on the screen. Something about the way he moved his hands over the wood, something about the particular quality of patience in his expression, pulled at a memory she had spent years trying to hold on to. She zoomed in on his face. She sat, very still. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out a piece of paper she had kept since she was 11 years old with a post office box number written on it in her own careful childhood handwriting, and she looked from the paper to the screen and back again, and her hands began to shake. I did not find the house. Judith found it, which feels important to say because the sequence of events that led to everything else depended on her finding it rather than me looking for it, and I have thought about that distinction many times since. I was not searching for a house. I had stopped allowing myself to want things that required a future you had to believe in to reach for. Judith was the one who had not stopped believing on my behalf. And on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, she called me from her car with an urgency in her voice. I had not heard from her before, and told me to get in my truck and drive to the address she was about to send me. I almost did not go. The shop was busy and the afternoon light was fading, and I had a mahogany secretary desk in the middle of the workshop that needed 2 more hours of attention before I could set the final coat. But something in her voice was not optional, so I pulled off my apron and locked up and drove to the address she had sent, which turned out to be a 2-story colonial house set on a hill at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, with a white facade and black shutters and tall windows spaced evenly across the front in a way that gave the whole structure a quality of calm attention, as though the house had been standing on that hill long enough to have learned patience. Judith was parked on the street in front of it. She was leaning against her car with her arms folded, and she was watching my face as I pulled up, watching it the way you watch someone when you already know what their reaction is going to be, and you want to see the exact moment it happens. I got out of the truck and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house and did not say anything for a long time. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the late afternoon light was coming through the clouds at a low angle that caught the windows and made them glow. The house had been on the market for 8 months, Judith told me. The price had been reduced twice. Most buyers found it too formal, too removed from the newer developments downtown. Too much of a commitment for people who were not sure how long they planned to stay in one place. I barely heard her. I was looking at the portico above the front door, at the dormers along the roofline, at the proportions of the facade, and something in my chest was doing something I had not felt in a very long time. I had seen this house before. Not this house, specifically not this address, but this design, these exact proportions, this particular arrangement of windows and roofline and centered front door. Ellie had drawn it. She had sketched it in the small notebook she kept on her nightstand during the years when we used to talk about what we would do when we finally retired, where we would go, what our life would look like when the children were grown, and we had nothing left to do but choose. She had called it her dream journal. I had found it in a box of her things 6 weeks after she passed, and had not been able to open it for 3 months after that. When I finally did, I had sat with those pages for a long time, looking at her handwriting and her sketches and feeling the specific grief of a future that would never arrive. And now the house she had drawn in that notebook was standing in front of me in the October mist, as though she had somehow willed it into existence and left it here for me to find when I was ready. I told Judith what it was. I said it is her house. I said Ellie drew this. Judith looked at the house and then back at me, and her eyes were full of something that was not quite sadness and not quite joy, but lived in the space between them where the most important feelings tend to reside. She said, "Then I think you already know what you need to do." The purchase took 6 weeks to complete. I paid in cash every dollar earned from hands that had spent 12 years learning how to make broken things worth keeping. The day I received the keys, I stood alone in the empty front room with the afternoon light coming through those tall windows and falling in long rectangles across the bare floors, and I felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to name it. It was peace. Not the absence of pain, which I had mistaken for peace before, but the actual presence of something solid and quiet and mine. I furnished the house entirely with pieces I had restored myself. Nothing purchased new, everything, carrying a history of damage and repair that I understood in my own bones. A heavy oak dining table that seated 8, a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf in dark walnut, a writing desk with brass hardware that caught the morning light. Walter helped me move the largest pieces on a Saturday, and when we had finished, and he stood in the center of the front room looking around at what we had assembled, he shook his head slowly and said, "Cliff, you built a whole life out of pieces that were supposed to be finished." I did not put the new address on the shop website. I did not announce it anywhere or invite anyone over. This was not about being seen. It was about finally having enough room to exist without making myself smaller to fit. I did not know that a woman named Ruth Hensley, a former neighbor from the old street where Derek and Vanessa still lived, happened to be visiting her daughter in this part of town on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after I moved in. I did not know she drove past the house and recognized me on the porch, and slowed down, and we spoke for a few minutes politely, the way people speak when they are catching up across a large gap of time. I did not know what her eyes were doing while we talked, the way they moved across the facade and the porch furniture and the front garden with its careful plantings. I did not know that 3 hours after she drove away, she picked up her phone. 3 weeks passed between the morning Ruth Hensley drove away from my house and the morning the silver sedan appeared at the end of my driveway. I did not know they were connected at the time, though I suspected it the way you suspect weather from the way the light changes before any cloud has shown itself. I went about my days. I worked at the shop. I had Sunday morning coffee with Walter. I refinished a mahogany bureau that a woman in her 80s had carried with her through 5 decades and 2 cross-country moves. And I thought about Ellie's sketch in her dream journal, and I thought about Nora pressing her face against a car window 12 years ago, and I thought about the small wooden box in my study with its 2-word label and the 14 envelopes inside it that I had never opened. I thought about a lot of things in those 3 weeks. I was thinking about none of them on the Sunday morning it happened, because sometimes the moments that change everything arrive while you are simply sitting on your porch watching the valley fill with morning light and letting your coffee go cold. I heard the car before I saw it. The particular sound of an engine that has been maintained out of necessity rather than care, a slight roughness in the idle that a mechanic would catch in 30 seconds. The silver sedan came slowly up the street and turned into my driveway with a hesitation that struck me immediately, the way a car moves when the driver is not certain of their welcome and is leaving themselves room to reverse decision. It pulled in and stopped and sat there for what felt like a full minute without anyone getting out. The engine cut off. I set my coffee cup on the porch rail and sat very still and waited. The driver's door opened first. Vanessa stepped out with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has decided on her entrance in advance. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, close cut and neat, and she was wearing clothes that said effort had been made. The smile arrived on her face before she had fully straightened from getting out of the car, wide and bright, and deployed with the precision of something that has been practiced until it no longer requires thought. She looked up at the house before she looked at me, and I watched her eyes move across the facade the way I had watched them move in my memory 1,000 times, calculating, assessing, estimating. Then she found my face, and the smile went wider as though we had last spoken a week ago instead of never. Derek came out of the passenger side, and I barely recognized him. Not because he had changed dramatically, but because the change was so thoroughly internal that it had rearranged his surface. His shoulders were carrying the particular curve of a man who has been living under sustained pressure and has stopped straightening up between rounds. His hands went into his pockets before he was fully upright. He looked at the house, then at the porch, then at me, and his expression was something I could not entirely read, a complicated mixture of shame and confusion, and something else I could not name, yet something that looked almost like disorientation, as though he was trying to reconcile two different versions of a story in his head while standing in my driveway. Nora stepped out last and stood beside the rear door of the car without moving toward the house. She was taller than I had imagined, nearly as tall as her father, with her grandmother's dark hair and a face that had grown into a version of itself I recognized. From a distance, the way you recognize a song from the first few notes. She was holding her phone in both hands, her knuckles just slightly white against the case, and she was looking at me with an expression that was nothing like her mother's. There was no performance in it. There was something raw and careful and old for her age, the face of someone who has been waiting a long time for a moment and is not yet sure whether this is actually it or whether it will dissolve the way these moments sometimes do. Vanessa was already at the bottom of my porch steps. She said, "Hey Dad," with the endearment dropped in as casually as a coin into a jar, and she said she had heard I moved, and she said the house was absolutely gorgeous, and she said, "We have so much extra room up here, we thought maybe we could stay for a while, family should be together." She said it in one connected flow, the way you say something you have rehearsed enough times that the seams between the pieces have become invisible. I stood up from my rocking chair without hurrying. I walked to the small cooler I kept on the porch for warm days and took out 3 bottles of cold water and held them out toward my visitors. I said it was warm out and they should stay hydrated. I said it pleasantly, and I meant the pleasantness, and I did not move toward the front door, and I did not open it, and I did not invite anyone inside. Vanessa took a bottle and her fingers were cold when they brushed mine, and her smile tightened by a fraction that most people would not have noticed. I noticed. From the yard next door came the sound of Walter's screen door, and then Walter himself appeared in his weekend clothes with his watering can, moving along his rose bed with the unhurried pace of a man who has nowhere else to be, intends to be here thoroughly. On the breast pocket of his shirt, catching the morning light just enough for me to see it clearly from where I stood, was the small silver clip of his digital recorder pen. He glanced over at the porch once, gave a slight nod that meant nothing to anyone who did not know him, and turned his attention back to his roses. Derek looked at the house. He looked at Vanessa. He looked at the porch, and at me, and at the front door I was not opening. He swallowed once and said, "Dad, we are about to lose everything. The investments did not work out. The rental properties. The other things. We are facing foreclosure. We need help." He said it quietly, and without the scaffolding his wife had built around the same information, and the plainness of it landed differently than anything Vanessa had said. Then Nora looked up from her phone and found my eyes, and in her face was the fullness of everything she had not yet said, and all of it was asking a question I did not yet know how to answer. I looked at Derek for a moment after he said it, after the plainness of those words, the foreclosure, the failed investments, the help he was asking for, and I felt the particular clarity that comes when something you have been waiting for finally arrives and turns out to be exactly what you expected it to be. Not satisfaction, not anger, just clarity, clean and cold as well water. I called over to Walter and asked if he would mind coming over for a few minutes. He set down his watering can with the unhurried ease of a man receiving an invitation he has been expecting, wiped his hands on his gardening trousers, and came across the strip of lawn between our properties with the measured pace that had served him well across 30 years of contract negotiations. The pace that said, "I am in no hurry, and I intend to understand everything." Vanessa watched him cross the yard with an assessment in her eyes that shifted slightly when he introduced himself. "Walter Hale," he said, extending his hand. "Cliff's neighbor. 30 years negotiating union contracts before I retired." He said it the way you state a fact about the weather, plainly and without emphasis, but I saw Vanessa's posture adjust by a degree that she could not entirely control. She did not take his hand. Walter lowered it without offense and reached into the front pocket of his shirt and produced a small spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen, the ordinary kind, not the recorder, and flipped it open to a clean page with the practiced motion of a conscious man for whom this gesture was as natural as breathing. Vanessa looked at the notebook the way people look at things that make them feel watched. She asked what he thought he was doing. Walter said he was just listening and that he liked to keep notes for clarity. He said he had found over the years that people remembered conversations differently, especially when there was something at stake, and that written notes had a way of keeping everyone honest. He said it pleasantly, and then he looked at her with those quiet, unhurried eyes and waited. She redirected toward me. She said the situation was straightforward, that Derek was my only son, and that family took care of family, and that I clearly had more space than I could use, and that the right thing to do, the decent thing, was to open the door and let them stay while they got back on their feet. She said it smoothly and at some length, and Walter wrote it down, not theatrically, just steadily, his pen moving across the page in the even cursive of someone who learned to write when permanence still mattered. He asked how long a stay they were considering. Vanessa said that was not really the point. Walter wrote that down too. Then she said something that changed the temperature of the porch. She said that if I was going to be difficult about this, if I was going to stand on ceremony when my own son was in need, then that said something about my character that people might want to know about. She said they were not without options. She said the word legal in a way that was meant to land like a warning shot, and I watched Walter's pen continue moving at exactly the same pace it had been moving before, which was somehow more unsettling to her than any reaction she had likely anticipated. Nora said stop. She said it quietly but with a firmness that pulled everyone's attention toward her. She said, "This is wrong, Mom." She looked at me with those direct, careful eyes and said she had been sending cards to my post office box for years, ever since she found the address in the library when she was 11. She said she did not know if they arrived. She said she kept sending them because she could not make herself stop. I opened my mouth and closed it again. The wooden box in my study, the 14 envelopes I had never opened, the 2-word label written in block letters 12 years ago. I was still processing the full weight of what she had just said when Vanessa cut back in louder, now her composure showing its seams. Derek had been standing apart from all of it, quiet and still, in a way that was different from his earlier silence. His earlier silence had been the silence of a man following at a distance. This was the silence of a man trying to work something out, turning something over and over in his mind, and finding that each time he turned it, the shape was wrong. He was looking at the house at the porch at me, standing in front of the door of a life I had built entirely without him. And something in his face was doing something I could not yet read completely. Then he said it. He said it quietly, almost to himself, as though he was thinking out loud rather than speaking to any of us specifically. He said, "Dad, I thought you had moved away. I thought you left." He said it the way someone says a thing they have believed for so long it has become structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of how they understand their own life. And what I saw in his eyes when he said it was not guilt, not grief, not the manufactured emotion of a man looking for sympathy. What I saw was confusion that went all the way down. A man who had genuinely, completely believed something that was not true, And as I looked at my son standing in my driveway with that confusion on his face, my stomach turned over slowly, because I understood that whatever he had been told, he had believed it. All of it. And whoever had told it to him had done so deliberately, carefully, and a very long time ago. I asked him what he meant. I kept my voice level because the alternative was something I could not afford on that porch in front of all of these people with this much still unresolved. I said, "Derek, what do you mean you thought I moved away?" He looked at me with that same expression, the one that had confused me a moment ago because I had been reading it wrong. I had thought it was guilt wearing the mask of disorientation. I understood now that it was the opposite. It was disorientation so complete and so genuine that guilt had not yet had room to form inside it. He said, "Vanessa told me you had gone to Ireland." He said it plainly, the way you state a coordinate, a fixed point you have been navigating from for years. He said, "She told me you wanted to go back to your roots, that seeing me reminded you too much of Mom, that you had written to say you needed a fresh start somewhere you had no history." He said, "She showed me the letter." The porch went quiet in a way that was different from the silences that had come before it. Walter's pen had stopped moving. Nora was absolutely still. I could hear the birds in the oak tree at the corner of the yard and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower 2 streets over, and nothing else. I said, "Derek, I have never been to Ireland in my life." I said, "I have not left this state in 12 years. I said for the first 4 of those years I was in a garage apartment on Oak Street, 3 blocks from the house where you were living. Then I said I opened a shop in the center of town. Then I moved here. I have been in this town within a few miles of you for every single day of the last 12 years. I said I never wrote any letter. I said I have no idea what letter you are talking about, but I can tell you with complete certainty that I did not write it." Derek was looking at me with the expression of a man whose internal architecture is shifting in real time, weight-bearing walls, moving in ways that nothing is built to accommodate. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone with hands that were not steady. He said I took a photograph of it. He said he had looked at it sometimes over the years, trying to understand it, trying to find the version of events in which it made sense that his father had chosen to leave the country rather than find a way back to his family. He scrolled through his phone and held it out to me. I took the phone and looked at the image. The letter was typed formal, printed on stationery. I recognized immediately because Ellie had ordered it for me as an anniversary gift. 20 years ago, cream paper, with my name printed at the top in a clean serif font that I had always thought was slightly more formal than suited me, but had used for years because she had chosen it. The letter said everything Derek had described: that I was moving to Ireland, that the weight of memory in this town had become unbearable, that seeing Derek reminded me too much of losing Ellie, that I needed distance and a new beginning, and was asking him not to follow or contact me, and at the bottom a signature that was supposed to be mine. I looked at that signature for a long time. Someone had studied my handwriting. The overall shape was close, the proportions were close, and if you did not know my actual signature, well, you might not notice what was wrong with it. But I had been signing my name the same way for 40 years, and there was a specific characteristic in the way the capital C connected to the lowercase l in Clifford. A loop I had developed without thinking about it sometime in my 30s that had become as automatic as breathing. The loop in this signature was wrong. Too tight, too deliberate, the loop of someone who had practiced the form without having access to the unconscious habit that produced the original. And the language of the letter was not mine. Even in my worst grief, I had never written to Derek with that kind of formal distance, that careful coldness. The man who wrote this letter did not know how I talked to my son. I handed the phone back to Derek and I said, "This is not my signature." I said I did not write these words. I said whoever produced this document studied my handwriting and made a careful effort, but the signature is not correct and the language has never been mine. I said I did not leave. I was never gone. I have been here the entire time. Derek sat down on the porch steps. Not gradually, not by choice exactly, but the way a person sits when their legs have decided the conversation has gone somewhere the rest of the body cannot follow, standing up. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he stayed that way for a moment that felt much longer than it was. When he looked up, his eyes were red at the edges, and his voice, when he spoke, had lost whatever shape it had been holding on to. He said, 8 years. He said, I spent 8 years believing you chose to leave me, that you looked at your life here and decided that starting over somewhere I could not reach you was better than staying. He said, I used to read that letter when I was having a hard time and try to understand what I had done to make you decide I was not worth staying for. Vanessa said his name. She said it sharply, a single syllable like a hand reaching for something that was sliding away. She said he was confused, that he was misremembering that this was not what it looked like. Walter looked up from his notebook with the calm of a man who has heard many versions of many stories and has learned to wait for the one that holds together under examination. He said to Vanessa very quietly, "Do you still have the original letter?" He said he would be glad to take a look at it just for clarity. Vanessa looked at Walter and then at me and then at Derek, still sitting on the steps, and she said nothing at all. I looked at my son and said, I am going inside for a moment. I said there is something I have kept for 12 years that belongs to someone on this porch, and I think now is the time to bring it out. The house was quiet when I stepped inside, the particular quiet of a space that has absorbed the tension coming off the porch without comment the way old houses do. I walked through the front room and down the short hallway to my study, where the shelves hold the things that matter most to me: the deed to the house, the partnership papers, a photograph of Ellie taken at the coast the summer before she got sick. Her expression in it, the expression of a woman who is entirely where she wants to be. And on the second shelf from the bottom, where I had placed it the day I moved in because I wanted it somewhere I would see it every morning, was the wooden box. Cedar like Agnes Whitfield's chest, which I had always thought was fitting, small enough to carry in one hand. A brass latch that I had replaced years ago when the original one showed signs of fatigue. On the lid, written in the careful block letters I had used on a cold afternoon 12 years ago, in a garage apartment that smelled of linseed oil and loneliness, 2 words. For Nora. I picked it up and carried it back through the quiet house and out onto the porch. They were arranged more or less as I had left them. Walter stood near the railing with his notebook. Derek was still on the steps, not quite sitting, not quite standing, a man in the posture of someone who has just had the floor shift under him and has not yet found his balance. Vanessa was by the far end of the porch with her arms crossed, watching me come through the door with the box in my hands and an expression that was working very hard to stay composed. Nora was standing near the steps, and when she saw the box, she went still in a particular way, the way you go still when something in front of you is familiar before your mind has caught up with why. I set the box on the small table beside my rocking chair. I said, "Nora, would you come here, please?" She crossed the porch slowly and stood in front of the table and looked at the lid. I watched her read the 2 words written there, and I watched something move through her face that was too complicated to name. I undid the brass latch and opened the box. Inside, exactly as I had placed them over the course of 12 years, were the birthday cards. 12 of them, in the order they had arrived, the earliest ones at the bottom and the most recent at the top. The first ones were made from construction paper and crayon, the letters large and uneven in the way of a child who has not yet made peace with the distance between the letter she sees in her mind and the one her hand produces. As the years progressed, the materials changed. Markers and colored pencils, then watercolor, then a steadier and more confident hand. One of them had a drawing on the cover of a man and a small girl standing side by side with their hands joined, the man tall and the girl small, both of them rendered in the direct and sincere style of a child who is drawing what she means, rather than what she sees. I did not need to open any of them to recite what they said, because I had read each one enough times to carry them without trying. I took out 3 and held them so Nora could read the words she had written. The first said, "I miss you, Grandpa. Mom says you don't want to see us, but I don't believe her. Love, Nora. Age 9. The second said, "I found your post office box at the library. I'm sending this there. I hope you get it. Age 11. The third said, "I just started working at the ice cream shop. I'm going to save some money for you in case you ever need anything. Age 16. Below the cards, the 14 envelopes. Plain white, the inexpensive kind sold in packs at any drugstore, each one sealed and addressed only to the post office box in Nora's handwriting and bearing no return address. I had counted the total once in the early years on a night when I needed something to hold on to. $960 accumulated in bills of 20 and 10 and 5, folded small inside the envelopes with the care of someone who understands that the money is not really the point, but is the only language available for the thing she actually means. I had not touched a single dollar of it. Nora's hands went to her mouth. She said, "You kept them." Her voice was barely sound. "You kept all of them." I said, "Every one of them." I said, "I put this box together the year the first envelope arrived, and I have been adding to it ever since, and I have been waiting for a day when I could give it back to you." She made a sound that was not a word, and then her arms were around me, and she was crying the way young people cry when they have been holding something in for a very long time. Her whole body involved in it shaking from somewhere deep. I held her the way I had wanted to hold her for 12 years, and for a moment the porch and the people on it and the 12 years between us simply did not exist. Then she pulled back and turned to look at her mother with eyes that were still wet but had gone somewhere new. She said, "Mom told me you did not want to see us." She said it slowly, like a person reading something aloud they are only partially willing to believe. She said, "You told me I made you sad because I reminded you of Grandma." She said, "I believed you." She said it the way you say something when the act of saying it is itself a form of ending something. Then, very quietly, she said, "You lied to me about all of it, didn't you?" Derek had risen from the steps and was looking at his wife with a stillness in his face that was harder than anything I had yet seen from him. He said she had to have known. He said, "Nora, you sent cards for years, and she had to have known." Behind all of us, the front door of the house opened, and someone stepped out onto the porch who had been inside all morning. And when Vanessa turned and saw who it was, the last color left her face entirely. Judith Calloway had Ellie's way of entering a room. Not dramatically, not with any particular effort toward effect, but with the quality of presence that certain people carry without knowing it, the kind that shifts the atmosphere of a space simply by occupying it. She came through the front door and onto the porch with her silver-streaked hair pulled back and her expression carrying the specific composure of a woman who has been preparing for a conversation for a long time and has decided that she will have it standing up and looking directly at the person it concerns. She was wearing a simple blouse and dark slacks, and she looked in the morning light so much like her sister that I heard Nora draw a sharp breath beside me, and Derek made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word. Vanessa had gone the color of old paper. Whatever she had expected to find behind my front door, it was not this. I watched her process the recognition, watched the calculation move through her eyes, as she tried to determine what Judith's presence here meant, and how long it had been the case, and what had already been said inside those walls before. The silver sedan appeared in my driveway. The smile that had been her primary instrument all morning was simply gone. What remained in its place was a kind of stripped exposure that I had not seen from her before, and I understood that for possibly the first time since she had arrived, Vanessa Mercer did not know what the next moment was going to contain. Judith looked at her the way a woman looks at someone she has had 12 years to think about. Not with heat, not with the kind of anger that shouts, with the steady, patient regard of someone who has waited long enough that the emotion has burned down to something more durable than rage. She said, "Hello, Vanessa." She said, "It has been a long time." She said, "The last time we spoke, you called me to explain that Cliff was too deep in grief to have contact with Ellie's family, and that you would let me know when he was ready to reach out." She said, "I waited 14 months for that call." Then an email arrived from his account telling me he did not want contact. She paused and let that sit. Then she said, "I believed you. I believed both of those things because I had no reason at the time to understand what you were capable of." Vanessa said Judith's name. She said it with the tone of someone reaching for a lever that is no longer there. She said this is not the place for this kind of conversation, that there were things Judith did not understand, that she had been protecting her family, that the situation had been complicated in ways that were difficult to explain to someone on the outside. Judith listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Vanessa stopped, she said, "You sent an email from Cliff's account. You accessed his email and wrote a message designed to sound like him and sent it to me in his name to make certain I stopped looking for him." She said it without raising her voice because she did not need to. The facts were doing all the work the volume would have done. Derek was standing very still near the top of the porch steps. He had the look of a man watching a structure he has lived inside of for years be examined from the outside for the first time, seeing the load-bearing walls and the places where things do not line up the way they were supposed to. Understanding in the particular sickening way of genuine realization that the architecture of his own life was not what he had been told it was. He said Vanessa. He said her name the same way she had said Judith's, reaching for something that kept not being there. He said 8 years. He said, "You told me my father went to Ireland. You showed me a letter. You held me while I read it." He said it in a voice so stripped of its usual architecture that it barely sounded like him, and I kept my mouth shut because this was Derek's moment to arrive at, not mine to deliver to him, and there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. Vanessa turned on her heel toward the porch steps. She said she was not going to stand here and be ambushed by a coordinated performance, that this was exactly the kind of manipulation she had always tried to protect Derek from, that everything she had done had been for her family. Derek said her name again and she kept moving. Then she stopped on the second step and turned back, and her expression had changed into something I recognized from 12 years ago. The cold, focused look of a woman who has decided that the most useful thing left to her is leverage. She said, "Fine." She said, "You want to talk about what is real? Let us talk about what is real." She said Derek is Cliff's only son, that California law was clear about inheritance, that she was Derek's wife, and that no amount of family dramatics on a Sunday morning changed the legal reality that when I died, everything I had built would pass through Derek, and she was Derek's wife, and anyone who thought otherwise had not spoken to the right attorneys. She looked at me when she said it, and the look said she believed she had just moved a piece on the board that could not be taken. Walter had been standing near the porch railing with his notebook closed in his hand. He looked at me now with an expression I knew well, the same expression he had worn at the end of particularly long negotiations, when the other party had finally played the card they had been holding all along, and revealed in doing so exactly where their real interest lay. He gave a slight nod. I gave one back. Then he reached up to his breast pocket, and instead of the notebook, he took out the small silver recorder pen and held it where everyone on that porch could see it. Vanessa stared at the pen the way people stare at things. They cannot immediately categorize objects that appear familiar until the context around them shifts, and suddenly they are something else entirely. I watched her work through it, watched her understand what it was, and then watched the understanding arrive at its full implication. Whatever she had been prepared for this morning, whatever contingencies she had thought through on the 2-hour drive here, this was not among them. Her mouth opened slightly, and then closed again, and in the silence that followed I could hear the oak tree moving in a light wind and the distant sound of someone's church bells 3 neighborhoods away. Walter said he had a habit from his years in labor negotiations that anyone who had spent 3 decades at bargaining tables understood the value of an accurate record. He said the habit had stayed with him after he retired because habits formed over 30 years do not simply stop when you no longer need them professionally. He said he had been carrying some version of this recorder for many years, that it was as automatic as carrying his wallet. He turned the pen slowly between his fingers and said that 12 years ago on a June afternoon, he had been in his garden deadheading his roses when he heard voices from the yard next door. He said the voices had carried in the particular way. Voices carry on still summer afternoons, clearly, and without any awareness of traveling. He said he had not intended to record a private conversation. He said the recorder had simply been in his pocket as it always was, and what he heard had been sufficiently specific and sufficiently alarming that he had made a decision that afternoon to keep what was on it. He said he had added to the record over the years since then, methodically, with the care of someone who understood that evidence is only as useful as its organization. He had files, he said, labeled by date, and described in the same spiral notebooks he had been filling since his first day at the bargaining table. He said he had always believed that Vanessa would come back. He said people like her always came back when they believed there was something left to collect. Then he pressed the button on the side of the pen. The sound quality was better than anyone would have expected from a recording made in a garden 12 years ago. There was ambient sound behind it, bird song and a light breeze, and the faint sound of a hose, and then a voice. Vanessa's voice, younger by 12 years but entirely recognizable, carrying the particular sharp edge of a frustration that has been building for some time. She said, "If the old man does not go soon, we are never going to get ahead, Derek." She used Derek's name. She said, "Do you understand what I am telling you? His being here is the problem. His poverty is the problem. The way he makes you feel obligated to a life we have already outgrown is the problem. And the moment he is gone, you inherit everything. And we can finally start living the way we are supposed to. Live instead of being held back by his failures. I have heard a great many silences in my life. The silence after a door closes on a conversation that has ended badly. The silence of a house after someone who lived in it is gone. The silence of a phone that does not ring across the span of years. None of them were quite like the silence that followed those words on my porch that Sunday morning. It was total. Even the oak tree seemed to have stopped. Nora had gone completely motionless, and the expression on her face was not grief yet. It was the moment before grief, the moment of full comprehension, before the emotion has caught up with the understanding. Derek's hands were shaking. He had them clasped together in front of him, and they were shaking anyway, the knuckles white against each other. He said, so that was it. He was not asking. He was assembling piece by piece the actual architecture of the last 12 years, laying it over the version he had believed, and finding everywhere the places where they did not match. He said, you told me he was the problem. You said he was dragging us down with his depression and his circumstances and his way of making me feel guilty for wanting more. He said, I believed you because you were my wife, and I thought you knew things I did not know. He said, I cut my father off because you convinced me that doing so was necessary for our future. His voice was not raised. It was worse than raised. It was the voice of a man who has understood something that cannot be understood partially. Walter clicked through several more files on the pen's display and read the labels aloud in the even tone of someone delivering testimony. A phone call placed to Judith Calloway 2 months after the funeral, logged with a transcript in the accompanying notebook. A conversation in which Derek was guided through the precise language he would use when changing the locks captured from the yard next door on a quiet Saturday morning. A recording of Vanessa intercepting a mail carrier to collect correspondence before it could reach my box, confirmed by the carrier himself, whom Walter had spoken to at the time, and whose statement was written in the back of the relevant notebook. Vanessa said he had no right. She said it was surveillance, that it was illegal, that nothing obtained this way was admissible or legitimate, or anything other than the obsessive behavior of a disturbed old man with nothing better to do than spy on his neighbors. Judith, who had been standing near the door with the stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for a moment to arrive, said that California law permitted recording by any party present in or within earshot of a conversation, that Walter had been present for or adjacent to each of these conversations, and that she had confirmed the admissibility of this material with her own attorney before today. She said she had confirmed it several weeks ago, which meant this morning had not been a surprise to everyone on the porch. Vanessa looked at me. Then she looked at Judith. Then she looked at Walter, who was standing with the recorder pen held loosely in one hand and 12 years of organized documentation in the other. And she arrived at something in her expression that I recognized from the far end of a very long road. She had run out of room. Running out of room has a way of changing people. Some people, when they find the exits closed and the record laid bare and the faces around them no longer arranged in the pattern of credulity they have always depended on, will simply stop. They will accept the moment for what it is and let it end. Vanessa was not that kind of person. I had known that about her for 12 years. Had understood it from the morning she stood on my front steps on Maple Street with her rehearsed sentences and her cold precision. And I understood it again, now as I watched her take a breath and reset. I watched her find something inside herself that she had apparently been holding in reserve, a final position she had prepared without ever expecting to need it, but had prepared nonetheless. She pressed both hands flat against her sternum. The gesture was practiced. I could see that now, the way you can see the machinery of a performance once you have stopped being inside it. Her breathing changed, became effortful, in a way that arrived too quickly to be involuntary. Then her eyes filled and the tears came with a speed that I had seen once before in my life at a community theater production Ellie and I had attended years ago, when the lead actress needed to produce emotion on cue, and the result had that particular quality of technical achievement rather than feeling. She said, "Fine," she said, her voice cracking on it in a way that was almost right but not quite. She said, "You want the truth? Here is the truth. I have stage 3 breast cancer." She said she had known for 6 months. She said she had told no one because she did not want to be a burden, did not want to become the problem in a family that already had enough of them, had been trying to get everything arranged and settled and secure before the situation became one she could no longer manage in private. She looked directly at Nora when she said the last part. She said she needed to know that her daughter was going to be taken care of. She said that was all she had ever really wanted. Nora went white. The color left her face so completely and so fast that I reached out and put a hand on her arm without thinking. She said, "Mom," in a voice that belonged to a much younger version of herself, a child's voice inside an adult's body, and she took a step toward her mother with her hand out. I felt the pull of it myself. There is something in the human body that responds to the mention of that particular illness regardless of context, regardless of what you know about the person invoking it, because the word carries its own gravity, and I had lived inside the real version of it and watched someone I loved more than my own life be taken by it, by degrees, and so had Nora. We had watched Ellie go. We both knew what it actually looked like, and that knowledge was the thing Vanessa was reaching into and using. Walter said in the same calm and measured tone he had used all morning whether she would be willing to provide her medical records. He said not out of doubt but out of wanting to understand the treatment situation so that everyone could be helpful in the right ways. He said it so gently and reasonably that refusing it could only look like one thing. Vanessa's expression shifted for one fraction of a second before the grief mask resettled. It was brief, barely there, the flicker of a calculation happening behind eyes that had been performing something else. And I saw it the way you see things when you have been watching someone carefully for a very long time. I took my phone out of my pocket. I went to my contacts and I found the name I was looking for, Dr. Ruth Kaminsky, who had been the family physician for all of us during the years when we had still been a family, who had treated Ellie in the early stages before the specialists took over, who had my complete trust in a way that very few people did. I called her number and put the call on speaker before Vanessa could object to anything, and I held the phone where everyone could hear. Dr. Kaminsky answered on the third ring. I told her who I was, and I told her what had been claimed, and I asked her as directly as I knew how what she could tell me. She said she could not share specifics of any patient's medical history without consent. That was non-negotiable, but she said she could confirm that Vanessa Mercer had been in her office for a routine physical examination 2 weeks prior, that she had run a full standard panel, and that all results had come back within normal ranges. She said there were no markers of concern in any category. She said Vanessa Mercer was, to the best of her professional assessment, in excellent health for her age. I thanked her and ended the call, and the porch was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Nora was no longer moving toward her mother. She was standing in the middle of the porch with her arms at her sides, and her face had moved through the white of shock into something harder and more permanent. She said Mom used it. She said the words slowly and separately like she was learning them in a new language. She said Grandma died of breast cancer. She said we watched her die. She said we sat with her and held her hand and watched her, and you used that. Her voice did not rise. It went the other direction, down to something very quiet and very final. She said, "Do not touch me," when Vanessa moved toward her. Derek said, "We are done." He said, "I am done." He said it the same way the last piece of a structure falls, not loudly, but completely, and with no possibility of reassembly. Vanessa looked at all of us one by one. Then she straightened her spine and her voice went cold and certain, and she said, "None of this changes the law." She said Derek was my son, and the law was the law, and when I was gone everything would pass through him, and she was his wife, and anyone in this family who believed otherwise had not thought it through to its actual conclusion. I had been waiting for that moment. Not with pleasure, not with the kind of anticipation that belongs to people who enjoy watching others discover they have lost, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has spent 10 years making sure that when it arrived he would be ready for it. Vanessa believed she had just played the strongest card available to her. She believed it because it was a reasonable belief given everything she knew. And the reason she did not know more was because I had been very deliberate about what I had allowed her the opportunity to find out. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out my phone and opened the video call application and dialed a number I had arranged in advance to be answered. Marcus Webb appeared on the screen within 2 rings. He was in his office, which told everyone watching that this call had been expected and prepared, for that a lawyer had arranged to be at his desk on a Sunday morning because his client had asked him to be available, and he understood why. He was a careful, precise man in his mid-50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent his career in rooms where precision matters more than speed. and he looked at the camera with the composed attention of a person who has read every relevant document and knows exactly what he is about to say. I turned the phone so the screen was visible to everyone on the porch, and I asked Marcus to explain the current structure of my estate to the people present. He said, of course, and he pulled a document toward himself on the desk and began. He said that 10 years ago, I had updated my will and established what was called an irrevocable trust. He said that Derek Mercer was named as a beneficiary, which was accurate as far as it went, but that the structure of the benefit was not what the word beneficiary might typically suggest. He said the inheritance was organized as an incentive trust, meaning that the assets held within it were not transferable upon my death in the conventional sense, but were instead accessible only upon Derek meeting a set of specific, documented, measurable conditions over a defined period of time. He paused to let that land before he continued. He listed the conditions: completion of a minimum of 6 months of family therapy with a licensed practitioner, maintenance of stable documented employment for a minimum of 1 continuous year, a demonstrated record of financial responsibility, specifically the absence of new unsecured debt for a minimum of 2 years. He said that the determination of whether these conditions had been met rested entirely with the appointed trustee, whose judgment was final and could not be appealed or overruled by any party, including myself. Then he said the name of the trustee. He said it was Judith Calloway. Vanessa turned and looked at Judith. Judith looked back at her without expression. Marcus said the most important element for the purposes of this conversation was the one he wanted to make absolutely clear. He said the trust was structured so that its contents could not be accessed by Derek prior to meeting the conditions, could not be borrowed against, could not be claimed as a marital asset, and could not be reached by a spouse under any legal mechanism available in this state or any other. He said the trust belonged to Derek alone, and only upon his own fulfillment of its terms, and that no other party had any standing with respect to it under any circumstances. I watched Vanessa understand it. Not quickly, because the full shape of what Marcus had just described took a moment to assemble itself completely. She had spent 12 years building toward a specific outcome. She had made calculations and maintained positions and told necessary lies and managed information and isolated the relevant parties and kept her husband positioned where she needed him, all of it aimed at a single destination. And what Marcus Webb had just told her, in the calm and organized language of an estate attorney, reading from documents prepared a decade ago, was that the destination had never existed. The trust had been structured before she had any idea it existed by a man she had dismissed as too poor and too broken to be worth her serious attention, and it had been structured with her specifically in mind, not by name but by design, built to ensure that the thing she had been waiting for could not reach her regardless of what else happened. She said I did this deliberately to exclude her. I said I did it to protect my son. I said I built it so that if Derek ever found his way back to himself, if he ever decided he wanted to build a real life on ground that was actually his, he would have the resources and the framework to do that. But only if he did the work. Only if he proved it to himself, not to me. Marcus said there was a remaining matter to address. He said Vanessa had 2 options. She could sign a legal waiver relinquishing all claims current and future against my estate and the assets of Mercer Restoration, acknowledging in writing that she had no standing with respect to either. Or she could decline to sign, in which case he was prepared to file civil actions covering fraud, elder financial abuse, forgery of legal documents, and deliberate interference with family relationships, all supported by documentary and recorded evidence already in hand. He said she had until the end of the business day to communicate her decision to his office. The porch was very still. Derek had not moved. Nora was standing close to me with her shoulder almost touching mine. Judith stood near the door with her arms at her sides and her Ellie eyes watching everything and saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. Vanessa looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not fully read, something behind it that might have been a version of grief stripped of all its performances. Then she looked at Derek and asked him if he was coming with her or staying. Derek said he was staying. He said it quietly and without hesitation, which was not what I had expected, and the lack of hesitation was what told me it was real. Vanessa looked at him for a moment with an expression that cycled through several things I did not have names for, And then she picked up her bag from the porch railing where she had set it at some point during the morning, and she walked down the steps and across the driveway to the silver sedan. Without looking back at any of us, the engine started. The tires moved slowly over the gravel of the drive and then caught the street, and she was gone, and the sound of the car faded out into the Sunday morning quiet until there was nothing left of it at all. None of us spoke for a moment. The valley below the hill was full of light now, the morning mist entirely gone, everything visible and clear in the way that late morning makes things clear. I sat down in my rocking chair and felt the full weight of the day settle into my shoulders, not painfully but completely, the way a long thing feels when it finally arrives at its end. I went inside one more time. To the safe in my study behind the shelf of deed documents and partnership papers, there was a manila envelope that had yellowed along its edges and softened at the corners from years of being handled and replaced and handled again. Ellie had written it during the last weeks of her illness, when the cancer had taken most of what she had but had not yet reached her mind. And she had sealed it and pressed it into my hands with the specific gravity of a person who understands they are out of time and is trying to make what remains of it count. She had told me not to open it until the family came back. At the time, I had not understood what she meant. I understood it now with every part of me. I carried the envelope back out to the porch, and I handed it to Judith, because I could not read it aloud myself. My voice would not have held. Judith took it with both hands and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. She unfolded the pages carefully, the way you handle something that has been kept a long time, and she began to read in a voice that was steady at first and became less so as she went. Ellie wrote that if I was reading the letter, it meant the family had come back, and she said she had spent a great many nights imagining this moment and trying to prepare me for it. She said if they came back for money, to give them nothing. She said if they came back for me, to give them a chance. She said I would know the difference by how they looked at me in the first moment, whether they saw a person or a resource. She wrote about the house she had drawn in her dream journal and said she hoped I had found it or something like it, that she needed to believe I had built the dream even without her in it. And then she wrote about Nora. She said she had seen something in that child from the very beginning. A quality of heart that did not come from instruction but from somewhere deeper. And she said she wanted Nora to have the house someday, not because of what it was worth, but because of what it meant, and because a home filled with love and repair and patience was the right place for someone who carried those things inside her naturally. Judith stopped reading and lowered the pages, and she was crying without trying to stop or hide it, and so was Nora, who had come to stand beside my chair at some point while the letter was being read and had her hand resting on my shoulder. Judith said Ellie had called her the night before she passed. She said Ellie's voice had been barely there, but the words had been clear. She said Ellie had asked her to find Nora if anything happened to me, to make sure the girl knew how much she had been loved by people who had not been allowed to show it. She said that was why she had never entirely stopped looking. I reached into the cedar box that was still on the small table beside my chair and took out the paper crane. I had carried it in my wallet for 12 years, and the paper had softened with age, but the folds held the shape intact, a small and fragile and determined thing. I held it out to Nora. She took it with the care of someone receiving something that has survived a long journey, and she held it in her palm and looked at it for a long time without speaking. 3 weeks later, we sat down to dinner at the oak table I had restored, years before the one that seated 8, and now needed every chair. Judith was there, and Walter and Derek, who had arrived early and stood at the door with flowers in his hand like a man who understood he was beginning something rather than resuming it. I had cooked the pot roast the way Ellie had always made it, and the smell of it had filled the house for hours before anyone arrived. When we were all seated, Walter lifted his glass and looked around the table and said to Clifford Mercer, the man who proved that dignity is its own form of justice. We drank. Then we ate. Then, slowly, the way trust always moves, carefully, and by small degrees we began to talk. A year later, Nora had the crane mounted in a small glass setting on a silver chain and wore it every day. Derek met the conditions of the trust on his own terms and in his own time, which was the only way it was ever going to mean anything. And I sat at the head of my table on Sunday evenings and watched the valley go golden in the late light, and understood, in the way you understand things that have cost you a great deal to learn, that the life built from broken pieces is not the lesser version of the life you planned. It is the real one. And that, my friends, is where Cliff's story finds its resting place, not in revenge, not in bitterness, but in something far more enduring than either of those things. I want to share something with you before we close today, because this story stayed with me long after I finished it, and I think it will stay with you too. What struck me most deeply was not the betrayal, though it was profound, and not the legal trap that finally closed around Vanessa, though it was earned. What moved me was the cedar box. A man with almost nothing, living in a garage apartment that smelled of linseed oil, saving 14 envelopes he never opened, labeling a wooden box. For Nora, and waiting, without knowing if the waiting would ever lead anywhere. That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing I have ever seen a person do. The lesson I take from Cliff's life is this: the way you respond to being discarded says everything about who you are and nothing about your worth. Build anyway. Restore anyway. Show up for the people who cannot yet find their way back to you, because sometimes they are looking, and sometimes a paper crane kept in a wallet for 12 years is the thing that finally shows them the way home. My advice is simple. Do not let the people who underestimated you become the reason you stop believing in yourself. Do not cut off the ones who love you because someone with a louder voice told you to. And if someone in your life is being isolated from the people who care about them, pay attention. Say something. Be a Walter. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is a quiet man with a recorder pen and 30 years of patience. Thank you for being here today.